HOA buried my field tile, so I waited as their fairways sank into soft bog. What happens when buried drainage meets ground that refuses to stay firm? And how long can a fairway remain untouched when the field tile beneath it is gone? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Before we get started, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Your continued support means more than you know, and thank you for spending part of your day here with us. I truly appreciate every view, every comment, and everyone who keeps coming back for these stories. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now get comfortable, stay with me, and let us begin the story. The grass looked perfect until my boot sank 3 inches into the fairway. That was the moment I knew Fairview Greens had finally discovered what happens when somebody treats drainage like decoration. It was early May in eastern Iowa, one of those bright mornings when the sky looks scrubbed clean after 3 days of rain. The air smelled like wet soil, fresh-cut grass, and fertilizer. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, a mower hummed steadily across the higher ground. I was standing near the 7th fairway with mud squeezing around the heel of my work boot when Victoria Caldwell came marching toward me from the clubhouse. She was 54, blonde, polished, and dressed like every morning came with a board meeting attached. Even across 50 yards of soggy turf, I could see the irritation in her face. "Ethan, your farm is flooding our course again." Again. That word almost made me laugh. I am Ethan Walker, 48 years old, third-generation owner of 86 acres bordering Fairview Greens, and I spent 18 years installing agricultural drainage before taking over the family farm full-time. I knew this ground before there was a clubhouse, before there were golf carts, before developers carved fairways through cornfields and started calling the place luxury living. I looked past Victoria toward the 7th green. A maintenance cart had crossed it earlier that morning. Its tires had pressed 2 dark grooves into turf that should have been firm enough to carry equipment. Farther downhill, standing water reflected the white clubhouse like a broken mirror. Victoria pointed toward my property. "This water is coming from your side." I crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. Cool. Saturated. Soft beneath the root zone. Then I looked toward the low strip of ground separating the course from my field. 6 weeks earlier, there had been a field tile outlet there. Not pretty. Not impressive. Just an old drainage line that had quietly moved groundwater for decades. Now there was fresh fill, new sod, and a decorative row of ornamental grass planted exactly where that outlet used to breathe. Victoria folded her arms. "Well," I stood and wiped the mud onto my jeans. "How long has this been soft?" "That is not relevant. It is if you want to know where the water is coming from." Her expression tightened. She told me the HOA had already contacted its landscaping contractor and expected me to address runoff from my acreage immediately. I asked whether she remembered the drainage work performed in March. Her eyes flicked toward the landscaped strip for half a second. "That was enough. We improved that area," she said. "Improved." I could hear my father's voice in my head, the same sentence he used whenever somebody wanted to change a ditch because they did not like how it looked. Water does not care about appearances. I walked toward the edge of the fairway, counting my steps until I reached the spot where an old red marker should have been. Gone. Buried beneath sod. Behind me, Victoria kept talking about property standards, course conditions, and responsibility. I barely heard her. My attention was on the ground. 30 feet away, another golf cart rolled slowly across the fairway. Its front tire dropped into the turf, leaving a deep impression before climbing out again. The driver stopped and stared down. Victoria stopped talking. I looked at the soft green surface, then toward my farm beyond the fence. 6 weeks earlier, her contractor had buried the one piece of infrastructure nobody at Fairview Greens had bothered to understand. Now she wanted me to explain why the water had stopped leaving. I already knew the answer. What Victoria did not know was that my father had mapped every field tile on those 86 acres by hand, including the line running beneath the land where she was standing. The map was still exactly where my father had left it, folded inside a cracked leather binder on the second shelf of the farm office. I found it that afternoon beneath old seed invoices and property tax records, the paper yellowed at the edges and soft from decades of use. When I unfolded it across my workbench, I could almost smell Dad's coffee mixed with the machine oil that always seemed to follow him indoors. Red pencil lines crossed the 86 acres like veins. Every line represented field tile. Some had been installed by my grandfather using 4-inch clay sections back, when drainage work meant a shovel, patience, and a strong back. Dad replaced damaged sections over the years with perforated plastic pipe, but he never changed the basic system. Water entered through the soil, moved underground through the tile, and followed gravity toward the natural outlet along the eastern edge. Simple, quiet, reliable. I grew up listening to that system work. After heavy spring rain, Dad would take me to a clean-out near the fence and lift the cap. You could hear water rushing below the surface even when the field above looked perfectly dry. That sound, he once told me, is why we can plant corn instead of cattails. I was 12 when he first showed me how to read the map. By 25, I was installing drainage systems professionally across eastern Iowa. I learned grades, soil types, outlet elevations, and the expensive consequences of getting any of them wrong. That experience was one reason I noticed Fairview Greens long before Victoria noticed me. The development arrived 15 years ago when a company bought the neighboring farmland and turned nearly 200 acres into expensive houses wrapped around an 18-hole golf course. Dad worried about what construction would do to the old drainage network. The developers actually handled it carefully at first. Their engineers surveyed the existing tile, preserved the main outlet corridor, and connected portions of the new stormwater design around it. I still had copies of those early plans. For years, everything worked. Then Victoria became HOA president. She liked clean edges, decorative landscaping, and projects residents could photograph for the community newsletter. Old drainage features did not fit that vision. 6 weeks before I stood sinking into the 7th fairway, I had heard diesel engines beyond my eastern fence just after 7 in the morning. The March air smelled like thawing soil and exhaust. I walked toward the sound and found a compact excavator beside the old tile outlet. A landscaping crew had stripped away the grass and was pushing dark fill into the shallow drainage corridor. The red marker Dad had placed there years earlier leaned sideways beside the bucket. Victoria stood nearby in a navy coat, studying a landscape drawing. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked up without concern. "Cleaning up this eyesore." I pointed toward the exposed pipe. "That is a functioning field tile outlet." She glanced at it like I had identified an abandoned soda can. "Our contractor says this area stays wet because that old farm drainage dumps water here." I told her she had it backward. The tile did not create the wet ground. It removed water from it. More importantly, portions of Fairview Greens depended on the same historic drainage corridor. Victoria gave me the patient smile people use when they have already decided expertise is an inconvenience. The board approved the landscaping. "Ethan." I asked for the drainage plan. She showed me flowers, sod, grading, and ornamental grass. No tile elevations. No flow calculations. No engineer's stamp. I looked at the excavator, then at Dad's red marker lying in the mud. "Before you bury anything," I said, "you should find out where that line goes." Victoria folded the drawing against her coat. "We already have." Behind her, the excavator bucket lowered again. The hollow clay pipe disappeared beneath another load of soil, and the sound of running water beneath my feet slowly went quiet. By the next morning, the old clean-out on my side of the fence was already telling me Victoria had been wrong. I unscrewed the cap just after sunrise and heard something I had never heard there in 40 years. Silence. Normally, after a March thaw, water moved through that line with a low hollow rush, steady enough that Dad used to joke it sounded like a creek trapped underground. Now I smelled wet clay and cold soil, but heard nothing. I lowered a measuring rod into the cleanout. Water stood nearly 14 inches higher than normal. I wrote the number in a yellow notebook, marked the date, then photographed the reading beside my tape measure. That became my morning routine. Water depth, rainfall, soil condition, temperature, photograph. I did not touch the buried outlet. I did not cross onto HOA property. I simply watched. 3 days later, Victoria sent me a certified letter accusing my agricultural drainage system of creating excessive moisture near Fairview Greens. The paper was thick, expensive, and full of phrases like community protection and corrective responsibility. I read it twice at my kitchen table while the coffee maker hissed behind me. Then I noticed the sentence that mattered. The HOA demanded that I prevent water from entering association property through any existing farm drainage infrastructure. I almost admired the contradiction. They had buried the outlet, and now they were ordering me to stop water from reaching the outlet they had buried. I called Victoria. "Who engineered your grading work?" I asked. "Our landscaping company handled the project." "That is not what I asked." A pause. "The board approved everything necessary. Do you have tile elevations?" Another pause. "Ethan, this is not complicated." I looked through the kitchen window toward the eastern field. Dark patches were beginning to appear where the soil should have been drying. "No," I said. "It really is not." That afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office. The building smelled like old paper, carpet dust, and copier toner. A clerk helped me retrieve the original development records for Fairview Greens. The plans were rolled inside cardboard tubes, their edges curled from age. I spread them across a wide table and started tracing lines. Storm drains, retention areas, grading contours. Then I found what I was looking for. A dashed line crossed beneath the future golf course and connected directly with the drainage corridor beside my farm. Existing agricultural tile, preserved where practical. I followed it with my finger. The line ran beneath portions of the 6th, 7th, and 8th fairways before reaching the outlet Victoria had covered. Attached to the plan was an engineering note requiring review before any grading that could obstruct established subsurface drainage. I requested certified copies. Back at the farm, I opened Dad's hand-drawn map beside the county plan. The red pencil lines matched. Not approximately. Exactly. I sat there listening to the wall clock tick while everything clicked into place. Fairview Greens had not simply buried one of my old pipes. Their own development engineers had documented that drainage network 15 years earlier. The next morning brought half an inch of rain. By noon, the clean-out water had climbed another 4 inches. I drove 2 red stakes into my field at known points above the tile and recorded the saturated area around each one. Then Victoria appeared at the fence in her white sport utility vehicle. She stepped out wearing clean boots that had never seen field mud and held another folder against her chest. "You need to fix this before golf season," she said. I looked at the standing water behind me, then at the manicured course beyond her shoulder. "I tried to stop you from breaking it." Her smile disappeared. "Our property is perfectly fine. Somewhere beneath the ground between us, trapped water pressed against a drainage system that no longer had an open path." I closed my notebook. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Victoria's confidence lasted exactly 11 days. The rain stopped, the wind shifted south, and daytime temperatures climbed into the upper 60s. Under normal conditions, my fields would have started firming almost immediately. Instead, the eastern 12 acres stayed dark and heavy. Every step pulled at my boots with a wet sucking sound, and the smell of saturated black soil hung in the warm air. I checked the cleanout at 6:30 every morning. 17 inches above normal. Then 19. Then 21. I marked every reading in the yellow notebook and photographed the measuring rod before pulling it free. Across the fence, Fairview Greens still looked flawless from a distance. Bright turf, white flags, freshly edged cart paths. Victoria even sent out a community newsletter announcing that the course would open on schedule. But ground tells the truth differently than photographs do. The first sign came from the maintenance crew. Their mowers stopped crossing the low side of the 7th fairway. Instead, the operator began making an awkward turn 30 yards early, leaving a strip of taller grass near the boundary. 2 days later, I watched a utility cart roll across the same area and leave tracks nearly 2 inches deep. Nobody needed a drainage degree to understand that. Victoria did what she always did when reality became inconvenient. She sent another letter. This one claimed abnormal agricultural runoff from my farm was threatening HOA recreational property and demanded immediate mitigation. I handed it to my attorney, Samuel Reed, who had represented local farmers in easement disputes for more than 20 years. His office smelled like leather chairs and stale coffee. He read the letter, then looked at the certified county plans I had brought with me. "Do not alter anything," he said. "Not the tile, not the outlet, not their grading. Preserve the condition exactly as they created it." That suited me fine. I had no intention of fixing Victoria's mistake while she was still trying to blame me for it. Samuel sent the HOA a preservation notice requesting contractor records, board minutes, engineering documents, photographs, invoices, and every communication concerning the March landscaping project. Then I hired Laura Bennett, a licensed land surveyor, to locate the historical drainage corridor. She arrived the following Monday with a bright yellow survey receiver and mud already dried across her work boots. We spent 4 hours tracing elevations from my cleanout toward the golf course. By noon, she had confirmed what Dad's map showed. The tile followed the natural grade toward Fairview Greens and crossed beneath the exact area Victoria's contractor had filled. Laura drove new red stakes along my property line. I could hear Dad's voice again as each wooden marker entered the soil. Know where the water goes before you move dirt. Victoria arrived before Laura finished. She stepped from her white sport utility vehicle and stared at the survey equipment. You cannot survey HOA property without permission. Laura did not even look up. I am standing on Mr. Walker's parcel. Victoria turned to me. You are escalating this unnecessarily. I held up the certified development plan. I am measuring. She glanced at the paper but refused to take it. Our contractor says the drainage work was routine. Then your records should make that easy to prove. For once, she had no immediate answer. A breeze moved across the course carrying the smell of cut grass and wet earth. Somewhere near the 7th fairway, a mower engine slowed, then stopped completely. We all looked toward the sound. One rear tire had settled visibly into the soft turf. The operator climbed down and inspected the ground while another employee waved a cart away from the area. Victoria's face changed for half a second. Not fear. Recognition. She finally understood that the problem was no longer hidden beneath the grass. I slipped the county plan back into its envelope. You wanted me to fix the water, I said. First, we are going to document why it stopped moving. The first useful thing the HOA sent us was not an engineering report. It was an invoice. Samuel forwarded it to me late Tuesday afternoon with one sentence in his email. Read the description carefully. I printed the page in my farm office while rain tapped softly against the metal roof. The contractor had billed Fairview Greens $12,800 for grading, landscape restoration, soil placement, and beautification along the eastern course boundary. There was no mention of field tile, no drainage study, no subsurface inspection, nothing about the old outlet they had buried beneath several feet of fill and fresh sod. I set the invoice beside Dad's map and stared at the red pencil line disappearing beneath the 7th fairway. The next morning, Samuel received the board minutes. That was where Victoria's version started coming apart. 2 months before the work began, she had proposed improving what she called the unfinished edge of the golf course before Fairview Greens hosted its annual spring invitational. Residents had complained that the shallow drainage corridor looked muddy in photographs. Victoria wanted decorative grasses, smoother grading, and enough usable turf to widen the maintenance approach beside the 7th hole. One board member had asked whether changing the low area could affect drainage. According to the minutes, Victoria answered that the landscaping contractor would handle it. That sentence stayed with me. Not an engineer. Not the county. The landscaping contractor. Samuel requested the contractor's communications next. While we waited, the weather gave us another 1.25 inches of rain over 2 days. My cleanout reached 26 inches above its normal spring level. I could smell stagnant water when I removed the cap. Across the fence, the 7th fairway had developed a darker green band almost exactly above the buried drainage route. The turf looked healthy from a distance, but when Laura returned to verify several elevations, her boots sank past the sole. This ground is holding a lot of water, she said. I nodded toward the clubhouse. They think it is coming from me. Laura looked down at the county plan in her hand. Water is coming from everywhere. That is what drainage systems are for. 2 days later, the contractor emails arrived. I read them at Samuel's office with rainwater still drying on my jacket. One message had been sent 3 weeks before excavation. The contractor told Victoria they had located an old tile outlet and recommended determining whether it remained active before covering it. Her reply came 47 minutes later. She wanted the visible pipe removed from the finished landscape and asked whether they could simply cap the area with fill. Another message warned that subsurface drainage might extend beyond HOA property and suggested consulting someone familiar with agricultural tile. Victoria's answer was even shorter. She said the board did not want additional consulting costs for a routine beautification project. Samuel leaned back in his chair. There is your notice. I felt no satisfaction. Not yet. I thought about the farmers who had installed those clay lines before Fairview Greens existed, calculating grade with tools far simpler than anything Laura carried today. They understood something Victoria had missed completely. Underground infrastructure does not stop being important because nobody can see it. That Friday, the county drainage specialist agreed to inspect the corridor. Victoria learned about the appointment before he arrived. She was waiting beside the 7th fairway when I walked over with Samuel and Laura. The turf beneath her shoes was visibly soft now. She held her familiar folder against her chest. "This has become completely disproportionate," she said. Samuel answered before I could. "Then the inspection should clear everything up." The county specialist opened the historic plans, looked at Laura's elevation markers, then walked toward the landscaped strip. He pushed a soil probe into the ground near the buried outlet. It disappeared almost effortlessly. He tried again 10 feet uphill. Same result. Then he looked across the 7th fairway, where maintenance crews had placed small ropes around the wettest section to keep carts away. "How long has this area been saturated?" he asked. Victoria blamed the unusually wet spring. I opened my yellow notebook. "Rainfall is within the normal seasonal range." He looked at my records, then at the old county plan. "And when did the saturation begin?" I pointed to the first elevated cleanout reading. "March 19th, 2 days after the outlet disappeared beneath the new landscaping." For the first time, Victoria stopped looking at me and started looking at the ground. The county specialist stayed on the 7th fairway for nearly 2 hours, and Victoria's explanation got weaker with every measurement. His name was Paul Mercer, a drainage engineer who had spent 30 years looking at Iowa soil after people tried to make water behave according to property lines. He started at the buried outlet, followed Laura's survey stakes, then checked elevations across the low side of the course. I walked behind him with Samuel while Victoria kept several steps away, her clean shoes collecting dark mud around the edges. Paul finally stopped beside one of the roped-off areas and pressed his probe into the turf. "The surface looks stable," he said, "but the soil profile underneath is saturated." Victoria immediately blamed my farm again. Paul looked toward my 86 acres. "That is exactly why the tile existed." She went quiet. He explained that agricultural drainage systems often crossed old property boundaries long before subdivisions were built. When developers preserved those systems, they became part of the practical drainage network whether residents could see them or not. Blocking an outlet did not eliminate the water entering the system. It eliminated the water's exit. I could hear a sprinkler clicking somewhere near the clubhouse, adding water to ground that already had nowhere efficient to drain. Paul asked Victoria to shut irrigation off in the affected areas until the investigation was complete. She hesitated. "The turf needs consistent moisture." Paul looked down at the mud around her shoes. "Not here." By late afternoon, he issued a written recommendation against additional grading and requested excavation records, photographs, and any engineering review associated with the March work. There was no engineering review. The following week, the 7th fairway started showing what the clean-out had been telling me for more than a month. The ground was not collapsing. It was losing bearing strength. Maintenance carts left deeper impressions. A mower created shallow ruts after one pass. The HOA superintendent closed the lowest section to equipment and moved golfers around it using temporary ropes and signs. Victoria called it precautionary maintenance. I called it evidence and photographed it from my property line. Then the 6th fairway developed a soft patch near the same map tile route. 2 days later, the 8th showed standing water after a rain that measured only 4/10 of an inch in my gauge. I added the number to my yellow notebook. 4/10. Nothing extraordinary. Yet Fairview Greens looked wetter than it had after storms twice that size in previous years. Samuel called me Friday morning. "The HOA insurer wants an independent drainage assessment." "Good. There is more. They want your historical records." I looked at Dad's map hanging above my desk. "They can have copies." The independent engineer arrived the next Monday with ground elevation equipment and decades of aerial photographs. One image from 15 years earlier clearly showed the original drainage depression before the golf course was finished. Another showed the preserved outlet after construction. Then came the photograph from the previous summer. Same outlet, same corridor, functioning exactly where Dad had marked it. Victoria stood beside the engineer while he compared the images. Her arms were folded tightly now. No smile, no folder. He asked when the outlet had been covered. "March," she said. "And when did the persistent saturation begin?" Nobody answered immediately. I opened my notebook. "March 19th. He nodded and wrote it down. "By then, The golf course superintendent had joined us. He looked exhausted. "We have lost access to almost an acre of maintained turf," he said. "Every time we put equipment on it, we make it worse." Victoria turned toward me. "You could reopen your tile from your side." That was the sentence I had been waiting for. I kept my voice level. "Not without knowing what your contractor buried, crushed, disconnected, or altered beyond my boundary." Samuel added that any repair had to follow proper authorization and an engineered plan. Victoria stared across the fairway, where bright green grass concealed soil too soft for a maintenance cart. For weeks, she had demanded that I fix the consequences of her project. Now the engineers were telling her the same thing I had told her beside that excavator in March. Before anyone touched another shovel of dirt, they needed to understand the system underground. The insurer's engineer found the break exactly where Dad's red line said he would. Not approximately. Not somewhere nearby. Exactly there. It was Wednesday morning, warm enough for short sleeves, and the air smelled like damp turf and diesel from the small excavator parked beside the 7th fairway. Nobody touched the ground until the county approved a limited investigation. Victoria stood behind the temporary rope with Samuel, Paul Mercer, the golf course superintendent, and 2 HOA board members while the contractor carefully removed the decorative sod. First came 12 inches of topsoil, then compacted fill, then another layer of clay-heavy material that should never have been packed over an active outlet without review. At roughly 3 feet down, the bucket stopped. The operator climbed out and finished the last section by hand. A few minutes later, a section of old drainage pipe appeared beneath the mud. The outlet had not simply been covered. It had been crushed and packed shut beneath the landscaping. Paul crouched beside it and photographed everything before anyone moved another inch of soil. Water immediately began seeping around the exposed section. Slow at first, then steady. The sound was faint, but I recognized it. That hollow underground trickle I had listened to since childhood. Victoria stared at the pipe. "That cannot be responsible for all of this." The insurer's engineer looked across the soft fairway. "Nobody is making that conclusion from one pipe. We are documenting the system." That distinction mattered. We were not guessing. We were building a chain. Historical maps showed the tile. Aerial photographs showed the outlet. My records showed the clean-out rising immediately after burial. Survey elevations matched the old route. The contractor email showed Victoria had been warned. Now excavation showed physical obstruction at the exact location identified in those records. By Friday, the insurer requested the complete HOA project file. That was when another email surfaced. The landscaping contractor had sent Victoria a revised estimate before construction that included a separate line for drainage investigation. $950. She had removed it from the approved scope. Her reply was still attached. She wrote that Fairview Greens needed the work completed before the spring invitational and that unnecessary consulting would delay beautification. I read the message twice in Samuel's office. $950. The HOA was now facing engineering costs, turf restoration, drainage repairs, survey fees, and possible claims because Victoria had decided $950 was unnecessary. Samuel slid the email into the evidence folder. "Do not celebrate yet," he said. I was not celebrating. My eastern acres were still too wet to plant, and every delayed day mattered. I had seed waiting in the shed and ground that could not safely carry equipment. So Samuel documented my agricultural losses separately while the engineers prepared a restoration plan. Across the fence, conditions deteriorated without any dramatic event. That was the strange part. There was no single moment when the course failed. The fairways simply became softer day by day. The 6th hole lost another section to temporary ropes. The 7th was shortened. Maintenance crews switched to lighter equipment. On the 8th, standing water remained 48 hours after a modest rain. Fairview Greens had spent years selling homeowners a view of perfect green turf. Now orange markers and white ropes crossed that view like punctuation. The emergency board meeting happened Monday night. I attended because Samuel had been invited to present the drainage records. Victoria sat at the center of the table, but the confidence was gone. Richard Collins, the HOA treasurer, asked one question that changed the room. "Were you warned about the tile before authorizing the work?" Victoria said the contractor had only raised a general concern. Samuel placed the printed email on the table. Richard read it silently, then passed it to the board member beside him. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The air conditioner hummed overhead. Finally, Richard looked at Victoria. This specifically recommends investigation before covering the outlet. She started explaining deadlines, budgets, and the tournament. Richard shook his head. You told us compliance was handled. That was when I understood the real trap had finally closed. It was never the mud. It was never the soft turf. It was the paperwork. Victoria had spent weeks blaming water for behaving naturally. Now her own email showed exactly who had ordered the one path designed to carry it away to be buried. The board did not remove Victoria that night. They did something she hated more. They took the project away from her. Richard Collins was appointed to coordinate directly with the insurer, county, and independent engineer, while Victoria was instructed not to authorize additional work. 2 days later, another spring storm moved across eastern Iowa and dropped 7/10 of an inch of rain before sunrise. I heard it drumming against my farmhouse roof while coffee brewed in the kitchen. At 6:15, I pulled on my boots and walked to the cleanout. The water stood higher than the previous week, but now I knew the obstruction had been exposed and temporary controls were being monitored. I wrote the measurement in my yellow notebook and headed toward the fence. Fairview Greens looked beautiful in the gray morning light until you noticed the ropes. The 6th, 7th, and 8th fairways had sections closed to carts. Water shimmered between blades of grass. Near the 7th hole, a maintenance employee stepped off the paved path and his boot pressed deep into the turf. The ground released a soft, wet sound when he pulled it free. By 9 o'clock, the golf course superintendent closed the lowest portions entirely. Not because the fairways had disappeared, and not because anything dramatic had happened overnight. The soil simply could not support normal traffic without causing more damage. Victoria arrived while Paul Mercer and the insurer's engineer were inspecting the saturated areas. We have an invitational in 12 days, she said. Richard looked at the white ropes stretching across the course. Then we have 12 days to explain why parts of it are unavailable. She turned toward me. You knew this would happen. I met her eyes. I knew blocking drainage would create a drainage problem. That is why I warned you. And you just waited? I documented what happened and followed my attorney's advice. I was not going on to HOA property and changing infrastructure without authorization. Paul nodded toward the excavated outlet. That was the correct decision. Victoria looked away. The restoration plan arrived the following afternoon. It called for removing unsuitable fill around the corridor, replacing the damaged tile section, verifying downstream capacity, restoring the proper outlet elevation, and monitoring soil moisture across the affected fairways. No shortcuts. No decorative solution. Engineering first. Landscaping afterward. The insurer authorized covered emergency work while responsibility for the remaining costs was reviewed separately. When excavation began, the smell of wet clay carried all the way to my fence. The crew uncovered more of the old line and found additional deformation where heavy fill had been compacted above it. Every discovery was photographed and measured. I stayed on my side of the property line. I did not need to supervise. For the first time since March, qualified people were doing the work Victoria should have requested before the first bucket of dirt moved. Then Richard called me into the clubhouse. The board had received the insurer's preliminary findings. The March landscaping project had materially altered a documented drainage feature without the recommended investigation, and Victoria had authorized removal of the drainage review from the contractor's scope after being warned about the active tile. The room smelled like fresh coffee and damp carpet. Victoria sat at the far end of the table, staring at the report. Richard folded his hands. We are voting tonight on leadership. Nobody smiled. This was not entertainment anymore. Homeowners were facing repair costs. The golf course had restricted access, and my planting schedule had been disrupted because someone wanted an old drainage outlet hidden before a tournament. The vote was 6-1. Victoria was removed as HOA president. She gathered her papers slowly and stood. Before leaving, she looked at me. You got what you wanted. I shook my head. What I wanted was for you not to bury the tile. Outside, the restoration crew had connected the first repaired section. As I walked toward my farm, I stopped beside the cleanout and lifted the cap. For the first time in weeks, I heard movement below. A low, hollow rush. Water finally had somewhere to go again. By the end of May, the sound beneath that cleanout had become steady again. Not loud, just a familiar underground rush that I had heard since I was a kid walking these fields beside my father. The engineered restoration took nearly 3 weeks. Crews removed the compacted fill, replaced damaged sections of tile, verified the grade, and rebuilt the outlet so water could move through the corridor instead of collecting beneath the course. Paul Mercer inspected the work before the trench was closed. Laura checked the final elevations. Richard made sure every approval, invoice, photograph, and inspection report went into the permanent HOA records. Nobody was interested in shortcuts anymore. My eastern acres began drying within days. The dark, saturated patches slowly turned lighter, and when I pushed a soil probe into the ground, it finally came back damp instead of coated with heavy mud. I planted later than I wanted, but I planted. Across the fence, Fairview greens recovered more slowly. The soft sections had to rest while maintenance crews repaired damaged turf and monitored moisture levels. The spring invitational still happened, but the route was modified around several recovering areas. There was no grand disaster, no ruined golf course, just an expensive reminder that grass can hide a problem for only so long. Samuel eventually helped settle my documented agricultural losses and the costs associated with surveying and professional review. The insurer handled covered portions while the HOA and contractor resolved the remaining responsibilities separately. I cared less about those arguments than I expected. What mattered to me was written into the final agreement. No future grading or landscaping could obstruct the documented drainage corridor, and any work affecting the shared system required proper professional review. Fairview Greens also adopted new infrastructure procedures requiring engineering approval before board members could authorize changes involving drainage. Victoria never returned to the president's chair. I saw her occasionally that summer walking near the clubhouse. We never argued again. One evening in August, she stopped beside the fence while I was checking the outlet after a thunderstorm. Water flowed clear and steady through the restored line. She looked at it for a long moment. "It is strange," she said. "Something that small caused so much trouble." I shook my head. The pipe did not cause the trouble. She understood. Nothing else needed saying. After she walked away, I returned to the farm office and unfolded Dad's old map one more time. The red pencil marks were faded now, but every line still meant something. I added the restoration date beside the eastern outlet, then folded the map carefully and returned it to the cracked leather binder. The following spring, Fairview Greens made it through weeks of rain without losing those fairways. Golf carts crossed the 7th hole without leaving deep tracks. Mowers ran straight through the low ground again. My cleanout never climbed beyond its normal seasonal range. Sometimes, after a heavy storm, I still lift that cap just to listen. The water moves beneath my boots through clay lines laid by men who understood this land long before anyone imagined luxury homes or a golf course there. Victoria thought burying an ugly outlet would make a problem disappear. Instead, she buried the solution. I never flooded her course. I never redirected water toward the fairways. I never touched HOA property after the work was done. I measured, documented, waited, and let professionals uncover what had changed. That old red map, the yellow notebook, the survey stakes, and the quiet sound beneath the soil did the rest. My father had been right all along. You can move dirt. You can bury pipe. You can vote unanimously in a clubhouse. But water does not care who sits on the board. It follows the land.